The bunker stank of sweat, smoke, and fear. Concrete walls shook as Soviet shells pounded Berlin above. It was April 30th, 1945. The Reich was collapsing, brick by brick, street by street. In the Führerbunker, the man who had once commanded armies across continents now sat trembling, a pistol in one hand, a vial of cyanide in the other. Adolf Hitler, the most feared dictator of the 20th century. Cornered. Hunted. Finished. At 3:30 in the afternoon, a muffled shot echoed through the underground chamber. Silence followed. Then a scramble, doors opening, boots rushing, whispers colliding with panic. The body of the man who had vowed to rule for 1,000 years was dragged, wrapped in blankets, burned with gasoline in a shattered garden outside. That is the story we were told. The story written in textbooks. The story sealed in Allied reports. But what if it was only half the truth? What if the world's greatest villain never died in that bunker, but slipped away into the shadows, hidden by conspiracies, betrayals, and cover-ups stretching from Berlin to South America? This is not just history. This is a mystery that refuses to die. The Second World War did not end with peace. It ended with questions. Germany was a corpse bleeding in the ruins of Berlin. Its cities reduced to rubble, its armies broken, its leaders supposedly dead. Yet, from the very first day, whispers began to crawl through the smoke. Was Adolf Hitler truly gone? Or had he escaped justice at the very last moment? The Allies, victorious, exhausted, desperate to close the chapter, announced the dictator's death quickly, almost too quickly. The Führer is dead, they declared, but no body was displayed, no photographs released. Only ashes scattered in secret, guarded by Soviet troops who told one story in the morning and another by nightfall. The world's most hated man had vanished into fire and rumor. Some believed the Soviet Union deliberately hid the truth, turning Hitler's fate into a weapon of propaganda. Stalin himself taunted the West, claiming Hitler had fled to Spain or Argentina, or even absurdly, to a submarine base in Antarctica. Newspapers fueled the frenzy, splashing headlines of sightings across oceans. Witnesses swore they had seen him on trains, in hotels, in remote villages. A ghost walking in plain sight. Behind the smoke of war, intelligence agencies scrambled. The FBI opened secret files. The British interrogated witnesses. The Soviets locked away fragments of a burned corpse. Yet none could provide absolute proof. Each trail led to another dead end. Each report contradicted the last. This was not simply about one man. It was about justice denied. About the possibility that the architect of genocide had cheated the gallows that his victims never escaped. And so, the story of Hitler's death became more than history. It became obsession. A puzzle that stretched across decades, across continents, across governments desperate to either bury the truth or weaponize it. This documentary will follow that puzzle, step by step. From the gunshot in the bunker to the whispered escape routes through Spain. From the files of the CIA to the jungles of Argentina. From the ashes in Soviet vaults to the DNA tests of our own century. At every turn, we will confront the same haunting question. Was April 30th, 1945 truly the end? Or the beginning of the greatest cover-up in modern history? History demands answers. But the deeper we dig, the darker it becomes. Because in the shadows of war's ending, truth itself was set on fire. Berlin was dying. By April 1945, the city that once dreamed of ruling Europe was a carcass being torn apart street by street. Soviet artillery pounded without mercy, day-night without pause. The thunder of explosions shattered windows, collapsed roofs, and swallowed entire neighborhoods in flame. Berliners cowered in basements, clutching children, praying for silence that never came. The Red Army was closing in with terrifying speed. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers surged westward, commanded by marshals who had vowed to plant the hammer and sickle in the heart of the Reich. They came with tanks, rockets, and vengeance, driven by memories of villages burned, families slaughtered, and comrades buried in mass graves by Nazi hands. Every block of Berlin became a fortress. Hitler Youth, boys as young as 12, were handed Panzerfausts and told to fight Soviet tanks. Old men of the Volkssturm, barely able to carry rifles, were sent to the front lines. Civilians dug trenches with bare hands, knowing they would never hold. It was war's final theater, a city transformed into a tomb. Inside the Reich Chancellery, Hitler raged against maps that no longer matched reality. His orders, to defend every inch, to counterattack divisions that no longer existed, were fantasies. Generals whispered the truth. Germany was finished. But to the Führer, reality was treason. Outside, the Soviet grip tightened. By April 25th, the city was encircled. No escape. No relief. Bridges blown, rail lines cut, the Luftwaffe reduced to wreckage. Berlin was alone, trapped in a storm of steel. The civilian population, millions of them, suffered the brunt of the collapse. Food vanished. Water ran dry. Fires raged uncontrolled. Mothers searched for scraps among rubble. Families huddled in subway tunnels, their faces lit by the orange glow of burning districts above. Some whispered that the world was ending. Others knew it already had. Still, the Nazi regime demanded loyalty. Posters screamed, "Fight to the last bullet." Loudspeakers barked orders that no one believed. In the dark, rumors spread. Hitler had secret weapons, hidden armies, plans that would turn defeat into victory. But the only truth was death. By late April, Soviet troops were within blocks of the Reichstag. German defenses cracked like glass. Resistance continued, but every counterattack was swallowed by the Soviet tide. The streets of Berlin became rivers of rubble, bodies, and smoke. And beneath those shattered streets, deep under the Reich Chancellery, the Führer himself prepared for his last stand. The city was collapsing above him. His empire had crumbled. His allies had deserted him. And now, with the Soviets at his gates, Adolf Hitler faced the final hour of his life. But what really happened next would ignite one of the greatest mysteries of modern history. The hour was closing in. On April 30th, 1945, the Führerbunker beneath Berlin was a tomb of flickering lights, stale air, and dread. Above ground, Soviet shells shook the foundations like a giant's fist. Each blast rattled the corridors, showering dust onto the shoulders of those trapped inside. Adolf Hitler, once the master of armies, now looked like a ghost of himself. His hand trembled uncontrollably. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken. Gone was the firebrand who had hypnotized crowds of thousands. In his place sat a broken man, pacing, muttering, clinging to illusions that no longer existed. He had made his decision. There would be no capture, no trial, no humiliation at the hands of Stalin. Death was his last command. At around 2:30 p.m., Hitler met with his inner circle for the final time. Joseph Goebbels, ever loyal, pledged to die with him. His secretaries sobbed. His generals stood in silence, helpless before the inevitable. Hitler shook hands, offered muttered farewells, and disappeared into his private room with Eva Braun, the woman who had married him just hours earlier. The door closed. Witnesses waited in the corridor. The seconds stretched into minutes. No one spoke. Then, at approximately 3:30 p.m., a sharp, muffled crack echoed through the bunker. A single gunshot. Silence followed. SS guards and aides rushed into the room. The smell of burnt gunpowder filled the air. Hitler sat slumped on a sofa, a pistol at his side, blood staining the armrest. Eva Braun lay beside him, her body still, cyanide capsule crushed between her teeth. The most feared man in modern history was gone. Or so they thought. Panic took over. There was no time to mourn, no time to confirm. Orders were shouted. The bodies were carried through the bunker's narrow halls, up to the blasted garden outside the chancellery. Shells continued to fall as aides doused the corpses in petrol. Flames roared, consuming the remains of the Reich's ruler in the very soil of his ruined empire. Witnesses swore they saw the bodies burn, though few dared to watch for long. Smoke curled into the Berlin sky, carrying with it the ashes of a man who had promised a 1,000-year reign and delivered only 12 years of destruction. But questions immediately arose. The cremation was rushed, chaotic, incomplete. The bodies were burned, but not reduced to nothing. Fragments remained: bones, teeth, skull. The Soviets would later seize them, hide them, and guard them with silence. For the moment, those in the bunker whispered only relief. The nightmare was over. Hitler was dead. Yet as the flames consumed his body, an unspoken fear lingered. What if the fire had not erased him? What if the world would never truly know? That single gunshot ended a life. But it also began a mystery that would ignite decades of doubt, conspiracies, and cover-ups. Because the truth of Hitler's death was not as final as that sound in the bunker suggested. The smell of gasoline clung to the air. Outside the Reich Chancellery, in the cratered garden littered with rubble and shattered stone, SS officers struggled with their grim task. The bodies of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun, hastily wrapped in blankets, were dragged into the open. Soviet artillery thundered in the distance. Bullets cracked through the smoke-filled skies. Time was running out. Hitler had left strict orders. His body must never fall into enemy hands. He had studied Mussolini's fate, strung up, spat upon, desecrated in a public square. For Hitler, such humiliation was unthinkable. His final command was to disappear in fire. Aides rushed, splashing petrol over the corpses. Flames leapt to life, consuming flesh, fabric, and history itself. The fire crackled angrily, spitting sparks into the garden. Witnesses shielded their eyes as the smoke thickened, twisting skyward like a dark banner. Yet the pyre was imperfect. Berlin was collapsing. There was little fuel, no time, and no way to sustain the fire long enough. Instead of total destruction, the blaze left behind charred remnants. A skull, bone fragments, teeth, fragments that would become evidence, secrets, and weapons in a new kind of war. The battle for truth. Inside the bunker, silence lingered. Goebbels paced, pale and furious, knowing the Reich was finished. Generals stood hollow-eyed, aware that nothing could be salvaged. Outside, the flames hissed and died, leaving smoldering ash in the garden of ruin. Soon, Soviet troops would storm the Chancellery. They would find the crater, the half-burned remains, and seize them as trophies. But in the chaos of war, records blurred. Some claimed the bodies were moved. Others insisted they were misidentified. Whispers began immediately. Had it truly been Hitler who burned there? Or was it a double? The men who performed the burning swore it was him. Yet their testimony, given under interrogation, often contradicted itself. Some described one body, others two, some even three. Memory fractured under the weight of fear. And into that fracture, conspiracy was born. The cremation was meant to erase Hitler from history. Instead, it gave birth to the greatest uncertainty of all. The dictator's corpse had not been displayed. His ashes had not been scattered before witnesses. Only fragments remained, hidden, controlled, manipulated. The fire had not ended the story. It had ignited it, because where there are ashes, there are questions. And those questions would haunt the world for decades to come. But the flames were not the most dangerous silence in Berlin. That belonged to one man, Joseph Stalin. And what he chose to reveal, or not reveal, would decide how the world remembered Hitler's death. The war ended in flames, but the silence that followed was even more dangerous. On May 2, 1945, Berlin surrendered. The Soviets marched into the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, stormed the bunker, and uncovered the scorched remains of two bodies in the garden. Fragments of skull, charred teeth, blackened bone. They claimed it was Hitler and Eva Braun. But Joseph Stalin said nothing. At the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, when Allied leaders pressed him, Stalin gave only cryptic replies. Sometimes he said Hitler was dead. Other times, he hinted the Führer had fled. To Spain. To Argentina. To somewhere unknown. His answers shifted like smoke, never clear, never final. Why? Because Stalin understood the power of doubt. To admit Hitler was dead meant closure. But to suggest he had escaped, that was useful. It kept fear alive in Germany. It unsettled the Allies. It made the West wonder if fascism might rise again from the shadows. Stalin weaponized uncertainty, turning Hitler's fate into a tool of propaganda. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence quietly stored the physical evidence. The teeth, the skull, the jawbone fragments, all were hidden in secret archives. Only a handful of officials knew their location. For decades, they would remain locked away, inaccessible, fueling speculation across the globe. In the West, newspapers screamed headlines. Hitler alive? Witnesses surfaced, claiming sightings in South America, Spain, even Antarctica. FBI files filled with reports of a man with a mustache slipping across borders, seen in cafes, on trains, in remote villages. Most were hoaxes. Some were fantasies. But they thrived because Stalin refused to end the story. The dictator who had killed millions had vanished into smoke, and the world's most powerful man refused to say where that smoke had gone. Even within Germany, rumors spread like wildfire. Some swore the corpse in the garden was not Hitler, but a double. Others whispered he had escaped through secret tunnels, carried by submarines to new lands. The myth grew larger with every silence, every half-truth, every withheld fact. The Soviets allowed the legend to live. And in that legend, Stalin found an invisible ally. For so long as Hitler might be alive, the world remained unsettled, and the West remained on edge. But silence cannot last forever. One day, the Soviet archives would be opened. The remains would be tested. And what they revealed or failed to reveal would send shockwaves through history. The flames of Berlin had ended Hitler's reign. But Stalin's silence gave birth to something more dangerous, a myth without end. And so the hunt began. Deep inside the Soviet Union, behind layers of locked doors and guarded corridors, a box lay hidden. Inside it were fragments of the most infamous corpse in modern history. The Soviets claimed these were the remains of Adolf Hitler. A section of skull, blackened and fractured. A jawbone with brittle teeth. Bits of bone charred from fire. They were kept in secret, sealed away from the world. Only Stalin's inner circle and the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, knew the truth of what lay in those vaults. For decades, the West asked, "Where is Hitler's body?" The Soviets answered with shrugs, evasions, or propaganda. Officially, they said the Führer was dead. Unofficially, they hinted he had escaped. And all the while, they guarded the fragments, hidden like a crown of shadows in Moscow's archives. The secrecy was deliberate. Stalin understood that mystery was more powerful than certainty. By keeping Hitler's remains locked away, he held control over the narrative. The Allies had no proof to show the world. Only Soviet claims that shifted with politics, with mood, with strategy. Rumors swirled endlessly. Did the Soviets really have Hitler's body? Was it a double's remains? Why keep it hidden? Each question added fuel to the fire of doubt. Then, in 1946, Soviet officials announced they had indeed recovered Hitler's body. They pointed to the jawbone and teeth as proof, matched against dental records from his personal dentist. According to their story, these fragments confirmed beyond doubt that Hitler had died in the bunker. But there was a problem. No one outside the USSR was allowed to see them. Western scientists, Allied investigators, historians, all were denied access. The Soviets revealed what they wanted, when they wanted, and nothing more. Their evidence was unquestionable, because it was unquestioned. This secrecy planted the seeds of conspiracy. In Argentina, stories flourished of German submarines arriving with high-ranking Nazis. In Spain, whispers of safe houses spread. In the United States, the FBI collected thousands of tips claiming Hitler was alive. And every time these rumors grew, Stalin said nothing. Or worse, he encouraged them. The skull remained in the vault, silent, unseen, but pulsing with power. It was not until decades later, long after Stalin's death, long after the Cold War had shifted, that fragments of these remains would be examined by modern science. And what they revealed was astonishing, because the skull in the vault was not Hitler's at all. It belonged to someone else. The question was, who? And if the Soviets had protected the wrong skull for decades, what did that mean for the world's most infamous death? The vault held secrets. But those secrets only deepened the shadows around Hitler's fate. The bunker had been chaos. Bodies dragged, burned, buried, dug up, burned again. Records were inconsistent, testimonies conflicted. And when the Soviets seized what they claimed were Hitler's remains, the truth became even harder to untangle. Officially, Soviet investigators announced they had proof. The jawbone matched Hitler's dental records, confirmed by his personal dentist's assistant. They insisted the evidence was irrefutable. To the world, they declared, Hitler was dead. But privately, Stalin whispered otherwise. To Churchill, to Truman, even to his own generals, he suggested Hitler had fled. He seeded doubt, then sat back and watched it spread. The result? A puzzle of lies, one that no one could solve. Witnesses who had been in the bunker told different stories. Some swore they had seen Hitler's body burn. Others claimed the corpse didn't look like him. A few suggested a double had been sacrificed while the real Führer slipped away. The cremation had been so rushed, so incomplete, that no one could say with certainty what was left in that blasted garden. Then came the Soviet reports themselves, contradictory, muddled, full of gaps. One file claimed the body was buried in a crater. Another said it had been moved, reburied, exhumed. Some fragments were sent to Moscow, others allegedly destroyed. The official record twisted and bent under the weight of its own secrecy. And through it all, the myth grew. Each lie, each silence, each contradiction gave oxygen to the idea that Hitler had escaped. Newspapers ran wild with headlines. Hitler alive in Argentina? Führer seen in Spain? Submarine brings Nazis to South America. To ordinary people, the confusion made sense. How could the most powerful governments in the world fail to agree on something so simple? Was Hitler dead or alive? If they could not provide certainty, then conspiracy offered answers. The Soviets fed those conspiracies when it suited them. During the early Cold War, Stalin found it useful to keep the possibility alive. Hitler's escape became a ghost story, a reminder of fascism's shadow, and a tool to unsettle the West. But the West was hardly innocent. The FBI, MI6, and CIA all opened files on post-war Hitler sightings. They did not dismiss them out of hand. They collected reports, traced rumors, interviewed witnesses. Even decades later, declassified files reveal page after page of alleged sightings. Each one carefully logged, each one considered. In the absence of truth, even governments hunted phantoms. The world had been left with fragments of bone, fragments of memory, and a story that refused to close. And when, in the 21st century, scientists tested the skull fragment so long displayed by the Soviets, the puzzle shattered again. The DNA showed it was not Hitler's. It was a woman's. A lie protected for decades. A deception that raised even darker questions. If the skull wasn't Hitler's, then what else in the Soviet story was false? And what really happened in that bunker beneath Berlin? The answers would drive the Allies into their own hunt. The war was over. Nazi Germany lay in ruins. Yet for the Allies, one question gnawed like a wound that refused to close. Was Hitler truly dead? The Soviet silence only deepened the unease. Stalin offered no clarity, only shifting claims and cold stares. For Washington and London, this was intolerable. A dead Hitler meant closure. A living Hitler meant danger. So the Allies began their own hunt. British intelligence first launched Operation Nursery, interrogating every captured officer, aide, and secretary who had been in the Führerbunker. Eyewitnesses were pressed under the bright lamps of interrogation rooms, their words captured in reports thick with contradictions. Some described Hitler slumped on a sofa. Others insisted they had only heard the gunshot, never seen the body. A few whispered of doubles, decoys, and escape tunnels. The Americans went further. The newly formed Office of Strategic Services, soon to become the CIA, poured resources into tracking the dictator's possible flight. They sifted through tips, telegrams, intercepted communications. They studied submarine logs, traced Nazi gold shipments, mapped escape networks through Spain and Switzerland. And then came the flood of eyewitness accounts. Reports claimed Hitler had been seen boarding a plane in Berlin before the city fell. Others swore he had been spotted on a U-boat bound for South America. Some said he was hiding in the mountains of Bavaria, building a last redoubt. Still others placed him in remote monasteries, his hair shaved, his mustache gone, living under false names. The files grew into mountains of paper, thousands of pages thick. Many were laughable. Some were terrifyingly plausible. The FBI in particular logged countless reports from across the Americas. Farmers, priests, and exiled Germans swore they had seen Hitler in Argentina, Brazil, even New York. The Bureau filed them carefully, stamped with red ink. Unconfirmed. Further investigation required. Each report kept the possibility alive. Each sighting kept the nightmare breathing. For Allied leaders, the uncertainty was dangerous. The war had cost millions of lives. The world demanded justice. To admit Hitler might have escaped was unthinkable. Yet to deny it without proof was impossible. So intelligence agencies played a careful game. They chased the rumors, but in public they reinforced the official line: Hitler was dead. A bullet in the bunker, a fire in the garden, an end in Berlin. Behind closed doors, however, the files told a different story. No body had been shown, no proof had been shared, and Stalin was not to be trusted. The Allies had won the war. But they had not won the truth. And in the shadows of uncertainty, the idea of an escaped Führer began to grow. Feeding fear, feeding myth, feeding conspiracy. Because if Hitler had cheated death, then the war was not truly over. And for intelligence agencies, one question loomed. What if the dictator was out there, planning his return? The letters poured in. From dusty ranch towns in Argentina. From quiet villages in Brazil. From mountain communities in Chile. From American citizens convinced they had seen him, Adolf Hitler, alive. The FBI opened the files, stamped them, and tucked them into thick folders marked confidential. Today, those declassified pages still exist, stacks of raw paranoia and tantalizing clues. Together, they paint a strange picture of a world haunted by the ghost of the Führer. One report, dated 1947, described a convoy of submarines landing on the coast of Patagonia. On board, witnesses claimed, were Nazi officers, and among them, a man with the familiar mustache. Another letter, sent to J. Edgar Hoover himself, insisted Hitler was living in Argentina under the protection of wealthy German expatriates, surrounded by guards, living in a secluded estate. Hoover, ever cautious, did not dismiss the reports outright. Instead, the FBI investigated. Agents interviewed immigrants, tracked financial transfers, followed rumors of Nazi colonies in South America. They found traces of former SS officers, war criminals who had indeed fled to Argentina and Brazil. Some lived openly, others under false identities. The possibility seemed chillingly real. If these men had escaped, why not Hitler? In one file, a source claimed to have spoken directly with a German colonel who arranged Hitler's escape. Another insisted the Führer had shaved his mustache, altered his appearance, and was being hidden by loyalists awaiting the right moment to return. The FBI chased each lead, often running into dead ends. But not all were easily dismissed. Photographs surfaced, grainy, blurry images of men who looked just enough like Hitler to stir doubt. The Bureau never confirmed any of it. But the fact remains, they never closed the case with certainty either. Instead, their reports were filed away with cautious language, unverified. Further investigation required. And so the files grew. Hundreds of pages. Dozens of leads. Hitler in a hotel. Hitler on a ranch. Hitler walking through a crowded street in Buenos Aires. None of it proved true. But none of it was fully disproven either. To the public, the FBI said nothing. But to the careful reader of history, the message is clear. The United States government considered the possibility that Hitler had survived, and they considered it seriously. Why? Because the Soviets had given them nothing but silence and contradictions. Because the body had never been shown. Because in a world rebuilding from ashes, the possibility of a living Hitler was too dangerous to ignore. The FBI's secret reports show the truth of the time. The war had ended, but the hunt had not. The Allies might have defeated the Reich, but they had not buried its leader. And in those gaps of certainty, Hitler's ghost lived on, in headlines, in whispers, in secret files locked away in Washington. But Hitler's escape, if it had happened, would not have been a random miracle. It would have required planning. Networks. Safe routes built by loyalists who refused to surrender. Those networks existed. They had a name. They were called the Ratlines. The war was collapsing, but the Reich had prepared for defeat. Even before Berlin fell, networks of escape were already being built. Secret arteries running through Europe, designed to carry high-ranking Nazis out of the ruins and into new lives abroad. These routes would become infamous. They were called the Ratlines. The Ratlines stretched like shadows across the continent. From Germany into Austria. Through the Alps into Italy. Across Spain and Portugal. Safe houses, false passports, bribed officials, they formed an underground lifeline for those who refused to face justice. And at the heart of it all were powerful allies. In Rome, elements of the Catholic Church became deeply entangled. Certain priests and bishops, claiming mercy or perhaps fearing the spread of communism more than fascism, quietly provided sanctuary. Monasteries became hiding places. The Vatican's charitable organizations, such as Caritas, were exploited to issue Red Cross travel documents. With a new name and forged identity, war criminals could simply walk out of Europe. From there, ships sailed, bound for Argentina, for Brazil, for Chile, for faraway havens where Nazi gold and influence had already secured protection. Some of the most notorious figures of the regime used these Ratlines. Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, slipped through them. Joseph Mengele, the angel of death of Auschwitz, found freedom in South America. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, used the same channels. If these men could escape justice, was it unthinkable that Hitler might have tried the same? The Allies knew about the Ratlines. They tried to block them, but the flood of refugees after the war made it nearly impossible. Millions displaced, papers forged, identities blurred. Amid the chaos, war criminals blended in and vanished. The Soviets screamed that the West was allowing Nazis to escape. The West accused the Soviets of spreading lies. And in the middle of this, the Ratlines grew stronger, fed by fear, money, and silence. There were whispers of German U-boats still operating after surrender, carrying precious cargo to the southern hemisphere. There were confirmed cases of Argentine officials welcoming Nazi officers with open arms, offering land, protection, even new identities. To historians, one fact stands out: the Ratlines were real. They existed. They worked. They saved some of the worst criminals in history. Which raises the ultimate question: if Hitler had wanted to vanish, could he have used the same routes? Did the dictator who ordered millions of deaths slip away using the very system designed for his followers? The Soviets said no. The West said maybe. Conspiracy theorists said yes. But one thing was certain: if Hitler had tried to flee, the Ratlines were his only chance. And some believe he did. Because among the shadows of Spain, another chapter of the mystery began to unfold. Spain in 1945 was a nation of shadows. Francisco Franco's fascist regime had survived the war by playing both sides, never fully joining Hitler, never fully rejecting him. When the Reich fell, Spain became a twilight zone, neither Allied nor Axis, but something in between. For Nazis on the run, it was perfect. The Pyrenees Mountains became corridors of escape. Smugglers and guides led fugitives across the borders of France and into Spanish towns where sympathetic officials looked the other way. Hotels, villas, and monasteries became temporary safe houses. From there, ships could be arranged. Money could be laundered. New papers could be issued. For years, Allied intelligence picked up whispers that Franco's Spain had become a sanctuary for war criminals. SS officers were spotted in Madrid cafes, Gestapo agents in Barcelona apartments. Networks of loyalists flourished in the open. And in the fog of rumor, one question loomed. Had Hitler himself passed this way? Reports trickled in. Some claimed the Führer had been seen in Spain in disguise, his mustache gone, his hair altered, a quiet old man moving with an entourage of guards. One account placed him in a secluded villa in Galicia, guarded by loyal Germans. Another swore he was seen boarding a ship in Cadiz, bound for South America. The Allies were not blind to these stories. MI6 and the OSS tracked leads, interrogated contacts, and intercepted communications. Yet, as always, the trail blurred into nothing. But Spain was not simply a staging ground. It was a political tool. Franco had no reason to protect Hitler publicly. Doing so risked angering the Allies. But secretly, harboring fugitive Nazis bought him leverage. Their money, their knowledge, their loyalty could be useful. And in a world already shifting toward the Cold War, anti-communism became the ultimate currency. This was the environment where the Ratlines merged with power. From Spain, fugitives could vanish across the Atlantic. And if Hitler had survived the fire in Berlin, this was the place he would have hidden, however briefly, before the next phase of his escape. What makes Spain's shadow role so haunting is not the certainty of Hitler's presence, but the plausibility of it. The infrastructure was there. The protection was there. The silence was there. The mystery deepened with every rumor. Because if the dictator had indeed crossed into Spain, then he had truly slipped the noose of history, and the door to South America swung wide open. And in the years that followed, South America would become the most fertile ground for Hitler sightings. Argentina, in particular, would grow infamous as the alleged final refuge of the Führer. The story of Hitler's death was supposed to end in fire and ash. Instead, in the alleys of Spain, it transformed into a ghost story. A ghost that would sail across the ocean and haunt a new continent. If Hitler had survived Berlin, if he had crossed the ruins of Europe through the Ratlines, then one destination loomed above all others: Argentina. By 1945, Juan Perón's Argentina was a haven for exiled fascists. The government admired aspects of the Axis, feared communism, and welcomed German wealth with open arms. Nazi gold, smuggled through Swiss banks, flowed into Buenos Aires. German companies rebuilt under new names. And entire communities of expatriates created pockets of Europe on South American soil. It was into this world of open doors and closed secrets that Nazi fugitives arrived. Not just low-ranking soldiers, but high-profile war criminals. Adolf Eichmann lived here, under a false identity, until the Mossad dragged him out in 1960. Joseph Mengele walked freely through Buenos Aires markets, then slipped deeper into the continent. Argentina was not just a refuge, it was a kingdom of shadows. So when rumors emerged that Hitler had escaped, Argentina was the stage where the story took root. Reports claimed he had landed in Patagonia, ferried by submarine to a remote bay. Others placed him in a secluded estate north of Buenos Aires, guarded by loyalists, protected by money. Locals whispered of a mysterious German nobleman who kept to himself, his face aged but unmistakable. Some swore they had seen him riding horseback, others drinking in small taverns, his piercing eyes hidden behind spectacles. The FBI collected these reports. The files exist: letters, interviews, even crude maps pointing to alleged hideouts. Most are riddled with contradictions. Yet together, they weave a haunting pattern. Argentina was the perfect stage for such a legend to thrive. And the Argentine government, whether out of sympathy, profit, or indifference, did little to silence the rumors. Nazi colonies thrived in the open. Towns like Bariloche became known as Little Germany, with Alpine houses and German schools echoing the fatherland. In these enclaves, it was all too easy to imagine the Führer himself hiding in plain sight. Historians debate the credibility of these claims. Some dismiss them as fantasy, fueled by paranoia and myth. Others argue that the sheer number of reports cannot be ignored. After all, so many Nazis had escaped through Argentina. Why not Hitler? The question hangs in the air like smoke. Because Argentina was not simply a place where fugitives hid. It was where they thrived. It was where the embers of a lost Reich glowed faintly in the night. If Hitler had survived, if he had lived among them, Argentina would have been his safest refuge. But safety breeds witnesses. And soon, whispers of sightings would become testimonies, sworn accounts from people who insisted they had seen the dictator with their own eyes. And those testimonies would spread the ghost of Hitler across South America like wildfire. The legend of Hitler in Argentina did not survive on rumor alone. It thrived on witnesses, men and women who swore, sometimes under oath, that they had seen him. The stories began almost immediately after the war. Farmers in Patagonia claimed a mysterious German visitor had arrived by submarine, escorted by officers who spoke in hushed tones. Hotel clerks whispered of a tall, thin man with a familiar face checking in under false names, always surrounded by loyal attendants. Hunters swore they saw him riding horses across the pampas, older, slower, but unmistakably him. Some accounts were more detailed. In the 1950s, an Argentine woman told investigators she had served drinks at a private estate north of Buenos Aires, where she encountered a man with piercing blue eyes and a clipped Austrian accent. He had grown thinner, she recalled, but I recognized the voice. Others described a German nobleman, living in seclusion, his face altered, his mustache shaved. A few insisted he lived with Eva Braun, who had survived alongside him, raising children in secret. Most of these stories came from ordinary people, but a few came from men with connections. One former SS officer, captured years later, hinted that he had personally seen Hitler in Argentina, alive and protected. Another testimony described elaborate escape plans, complete with submarines and secret financing. The FBI logged these accounts carefully. Some were filed as unreliable, others as worthy of further review. Declassified documents revealed dozens of reports between 1945 and the 1960s, all circling the same question. Was Hitler alive in South America? Historians, of course, are skeptical. Many witnesses were unreliable, motivated by fame, money, or delusion. Some sightings were impossible, placing Hitler in two places at once. Others were vague, based on little more than resemblance. Yet the sheer volume of testimonies kept the myth alive. In a land filled with actual Nazi fugitives, Eichmann, Mengele, Barbie, the idea that Hitler could be there too did not feel far-fetched. The soil of Argentina was fertile ground for such stories to grow. Journalists seized on it. Headlines screamed, "Hitler in the Andes." Books claimed to reveal secret hideouts. Even in Europe and the United States, the idea took root in popular imagination. A monster as vast as Hitler could not have simply vanished in fire and ash. He must have escaped. For survivors of the war, this was more than rumor. It was terror. The thought that the man who unleashed genocide might be living comfortably on another continent was unbearable. It felt like injustice made flesh. But for the Cold War powers, the question became strategic. If Hitler was alive, where was he? And who might be using him as a pawn? For in the shadows of Stalin's propaganda and the FBI's secret files, the ghost of Hitler was more than a myth, it was a weapon. And soon, it would be wielded in the new struggle between East and West. The war was over, but Stalin was not finished with Hitler. For the Soviet leader, the dictator's death or survival was not merely a matter of history. It was a weapon, and Stalin wielded it with cold precision. When Allied leaders pressed him at Potsdam in July 1945, asking if Hitler was truly dead, Stalin gave an answer that sent shockwaves. He is not dead. He has escaped, perhaps to Spain or Argentina. The statement was deliberate. It was not ignorance. It was strategy. By suggesting Hitler lived, Stalin unsettled the fragile post-war balance. Germany remained unstable, its people fearful. Western leaders were forced to consider the possibility that their war had not truly ended. And the Soviets, who held the supposed remains, gained leverage. They controlled the story, and in turn they controlled the fear. Soviet propaganda amplified the uncertainty. Newspapers hinted at a global conspiracy to protect Hitler. Radio broadcasts suggested the Americans and British were shielding him for their own purposes, perhaps to use against the USSR in the coming ideological war. To millions of listeners, the idea was believable. After all, Nazi scientists had already been recruited by the Americans under Operation Paperclip. Could their leader have been spared as well? The more the West demanded proof, the less the Soviets gave. The remains were hidden in vaults. Reports were contradictory. Witness testimonies were suppressed. Each silence spoke louder than words. Perhaps the Führer still walks among us. For the people of the USSR, the myth served another purpose. The war had left scars too deep to heal. The idea that Hitler might still be alive justified the Soviet Union's tightening grip on Eastern Europe. The fascist threat has not ended, the state declared. Therefore, we must remain vigilant. We must remain strong. We must obey. The propaganda worked. Across the world, uncertainty lingered. Western newspapers ran story after story. Hitler in Spain, Hitler in Argentina, Hitler spotted boarding a submarine. Each headline gave weight to Stalin's claim. Each rumor strengthened the idea that the West could not be trusted. And in the intelligence corridors of London and Washington, doubt crept in. What if Stalin was right? What if the dictator had truly escaped the fire? By the early Cold War, the ghost of Hitler was no longer just a mystery. It was a bargaining chip, a phantom enemy that could be conjured at will to justify actions, to sow suspicion, to shape the battlefield of fear. Stalin had turned Hitler's death into something more powerful than life, a myth. But in the West, the response was just as calculated. For while the Soviets spread doubt, American intelligence agencies began chasing shadows of their own. The ghost of Hitler was not only a Soviet weapon, it became a CIA obsession. And soon, the Phantom Führer would stalk the Cold War from the very heart of U.S. intelligence files. The CIA was born in shadows, and among its earliest ghosts was Adolf Hitler. By the late 1940s, as the Cold War sharpened, U.S. intelligence could not ignore the possibility whispered by Stalin and echoed in newspapers around the world, that the Führer had survived. The question wasn't just academic. If Hitler lived, he was a weapon, one that could be wielded by enemies or used to destabilize entire regions. So the CIA opened its own files. They collected reports, intercepted communications, and built upon the FBI dossiers already filled with sightings across South America. The leads were wild, contradictory, and often absurd, but they could not be dismissed. The specter of Hitler was too dangerous to ignore. Agents received sketches of estates in Argentina, where locals swore Hitler lived under heavy guard. Informants described him as an older man with gray hair, still issuing orders, still surrounded by loyalists. Photographs were examined, blurred images scrutinized for resemblance. Each time, analysts debated, was this a delusion or a threat? The CIA even entertained the idea that the Soviets themselves had spirited Hitler away, hiding him as a bargaining chip or as a propaganda tool. To some in Washington, nothing seemed impossible. One declassified memo revealed that as late as the 1950s, the agency kept active files on Hitler sightings. They treated them as serious enough to investigate, sending agents into the field, cross-checking names, places, and networks. While most leads dissolved under scrutiny, the fact they were pursued at all shows the depth of uncertainty. Why would the CIA chase ghosts? Because the war had already shown that truth could be stranger than fiction. Eichmann had been found living under a false name in Argentina. Mengele had slipped away, vanishing into Brazil and Paraguay. If these men could survive, why not the Führer himself? The CIA's obsession mirrored the paranoia of the age. Nuclear standoffs, espionage battles, shifting alliances. The world was a chessboard where perception was as powerful as armies. A living Hitler, even as rumor, could tilt the board. But in their pursuit, the agency also became a prisoner of the myth. Every unverified sighting, every rumor of submarines in Patagonia, every whispered testimony kept the file open, thickening with paper, thickening with doubt. The CIA never proved Hitler survived, but they never fully closed the book either. And in that silence, in that refusal to declare absolute certainty, the ghost continued to walk. By the 1960s, Hitler had become more than a fugitive in intelligence files. He had become a phantom enemy, haunting the Cold War. For the CIA, chasing him was less about the man and more about the fear he symbolized, the possibility that evil could never truly be destroyed. Yet while the intelligence world chased shadows, science would eventually step into the mystery. Bones, teeth, and DNA would become the new battlefield. And when the tests were run, the results would shake the story to its core. Because the skull the Soviets had guarded for decades, the so-called proof of Hitler's death, would reveal a truth stranger than the myth itself. For decades, the mystery of Hitler's death was buried in whispers, propaganda, and classified files. But eventually, history demanded more than rumor. It demanded science. The key lay in bones, fragments kept in secret Soviet vaults. A charred jawbone, brittle teeth, a shattered skull. These were the so-called proof of Hitler's end, locked away in Moscow for half a century. To the world, they were symbols of certainty. But to scientists, they were questions waiting to be answered. The first real breakthrough came in the 1960s. Soviet officials permitted a limited forensic study of the jawbone and teeth. Dental records from Hitler's personal dentist, Hugo Blaschke, were compared. Assistants who had worked in his office were summoned, shown the remains, and asked to identify them. Their testimonies matched. The teeth were Hitler's, they said unmistakably. The Soviets declared the case closed. But the case was never closed. The examination had been limited, tightly controlled, hidden from outside scrutiny. Western scientists were denied access. Photographs were few. Details were vague. And questions persisted. If the Soviets had absolute proof, why keep it secret? Why not show the world the bones of the most hated man in history? By the 1990s, with the Soviet Union gone, the remains resurfaced. Now under the control of Russian state archives, fragments of Hitler's skull and jaw were occasionally displayed, carefully guarded behind glass. The world could look, but still not touch. Then, in 2009, came the moment that shattered the narrative. A team of American researchers was granted rare access to a skull fragment long displayed as Hitler's. They tested it with modern forensic science, extracting DNA from the brittle bone. The results were shocking. The skull was not Hitler's. It was not even male. The bone belonged to a woman under 40. The world reeled. For decades, the Soviets had exhibited this skull as definitive proof of Hitler's death. But science revealed it was someone else entirely. A mistake? A deliberate deception? No one could say. The jaw and teeth fragments remained the strongest evidence. But the revelation of the false skull cracked open the case once more. If one piece was wrong, what about the rest? The mystery deepened. Historians argued, forensic experts clashed, and conspiracy theorists seized their moment. If the skull was not Hitler's, perhaps the jaw was not either. Perhaps the Soviets had lied from the beginning. Perhaps the dictator had indeed escaped. What was meant to be proof had become fuel for doubt. Science had not silenced the ghost of Hitler. It had breathed new life into him. Because the question was no longer only did Hitler die in the bunker? It became something darker. What else has been covered up? And when the skull crumbled under DNA analysis, the fire of conspiracy ignited again, burning brighter than ever. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. Because the truth about the remains, and the way they had been guarded, hidden, and manipulated, would expose not only mistakes but deliberate lies. The glass case gleamed under museum lights in Moscow. Behind it, for decades, the fragment of a shattered skull was displayed as history's ultimate trophy, Adolf Hitler's remains. Tourists gazed in silence. Scholars cited it as proof. The Soviets had said it was Hitler's, and that was enough. Until science broke the spell. In 2009, researchers from the University of Connecticut, led by archaeologist Nick Bellantoni, examined the fragment under modern scrutiny. What they found was astonishing. The bone was too thin, the sutures too fresh. This was not the skull of a man in his 50s. It was from a woman, no older than 40. The revelation shook the world. For 60 years, the Soviet Union had paraded this fragment as the proof of Hitler's suicide. Generations of visitors had stared at it, convinced they were looking at the remains of the most infamous dictator in history. And now the science declared, it was not him at all. How could such a mistake endure for so long? Was it incompetence or something darker? Some historians argue the Soviets simply erred. In the chaos of 1945, with burned bodies, collapsing ruins, and frantic soldiers, fragments could easily be misidentified. Perhaps the skull was Eva Braun's, or another victim of the bunker. But others believe it was no accident. To them, the false skull was deliberate, a smokescreen meant to confuse, to deceive, to maintain the mystery. Stalin had no interest in ending the story. By displaying the wrong skull, he ensured doubt would remain alive forever. The discovery lit a firestorm. Conspiracy theorists declared victory. If the skull was not Hitler's, perhaps none of the evidence was. Perhaps the Soviets had lied from the beginning. Perhaps Hitler had escaped, just as Stalin hinted. Russian officials downplayed the scandal, pointing to the jawbone and teeth still stored in archives. They insisted those fragments were authentic, verified by dental records. And indeed, most forensic experts still consider the teeth the strongest proof of Hitler's death. But the damage was done. The lie, or the mistake, had reopened the case. For many, it confirmed what they had long suspected, that the truth of Hitler's fate had been manipulated, hidden, twisted to serve political ends. The skull was not just a piece of bone. It was a symbol, and its falsehood proved how fragile official history can be when shrouded in secrecy. The world thought the mystery had been buried in Berlin's ashes. Instead, the skull's revelation gave it new life. A dictator who had been burned, buried, and declared dead was resurrected. Not in flesh, but in rumor, in conspiracy, in endless questions. And now, more than half a century after the gunshot in the bunker, Hitler's death was once again in doubt. Because if the Soviets had guarded the wrong skull for decades, what else had they hidden? The ghost of Hitler was alive again, and the world was no closer to closure. But if the science exposed lies, the media would pour fuel on the fire. For the Phantom Führer was no longer confined to vaults and intelligence files. He had entered headlines, books, and films. He had become legend. The world craves monsters. And when Hitler's body was never paraded in front of cameras, when no photograph of his corpse was released, newspapers seized the vacuum. From the late 1940s onward, headlines screamed across continents. Hitler in Argentina. Führer seen in Spain. Nazi leader alive in Chile. Each article was a spark, igniting fear, fascination, and conspiracy. Journalists knew the truth. That doubt sold papers. The man who had set the world on fire could not simply vanish in ash. Readers wanted to believe he still lurked, somewhere, waiting. So the press delivered stories, sometimes built on testimony, often built on rumor. Magazines published grainy photographs of old men with dark suits and stern faces, circled in red ink. Could this be Hitler? Tabloids splashed wild claims across their front pages. Secret submarines, mountain fortresses, hidden estates in the pampas. Every time a Nazi fugitive was captured, Eichmann in Argentina, Barbie in Bolivia, Mengele slipping through Brazil, the headlines asked the same question. If they escaped, why not Hitler? Hollywood joined the frenzy. Movies depicted the dictator's escape, his clones, his conspiracies. Pulp novels imagined him plotting a Fourth Reich from jungles or remote islands. Fiction and reality blurred until readers could no longer tell where history ended and imagination began. The myth grew stronger with every retelling. For survivors of the war, the thought was horrifying, that the man who unleashed such destruction might still breathe free air. For others, it became almost grotesque entertainment, a dark legend retold in cafes and classrooms. The media did not create the conspiracy, but it gave it life. By the 1960s, Hitler was no longer simply a historical figure. He was a phantom appearing on front pages, in movies, in whispered conversations. A ghost that refused to die. Even serious outlets sometimes gave space to the speculation. Why? Because the official story had holes. No public body. Soviet secrecy. Conflicting witness accounts. And most damning of all, the wrong skull in Moscow. For journalists, the uncertainty was irresistible. For the public, it was intoxicating. The legend of Hitler's survival entered the bloodstream of popular culture. And once it did, there was no way to pull it out. But behind the headlines, behind the myths, one darker truth lingered. The conspiracy was not only fueled by curiosity, it was fed by lies, deliberate and strategic. Governments had reasons to keep the world guessing. Intelligence agencies had reasons to chase phantoms. And dictators like Stalin had reasons to twist the story for their own ends. The headlines were only the surface. Beneath them lay a deeper web of lies, half-truths, and manipulations that ensured Hitler would never rest. Not in death, and not in memory. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gunshot. It's a story that refuses to end. The flames of Berlin should have ended the story. But instead, they ignited one of the most enduring conspiracies of the 20th century. The belief that Adolf Hitler did not die in the bunker, but escaped. It was a conspiracy that fed on three things: secrecy, silence, and fear. The Soviets withheld the remains, showed no body, and offered only contradictions. The Allies had no proof of their own. And the world, still scarred by war, struggled to accept that such a monster could vanish so completely. Into that void, conspiracy rushed like floodwater. The theories multiplied. Some claimed Hitler had fled by submarine to Patagonia. Others insisted he had flown from Berlin in the final days, whisked away under cover of darkness. Still others said he had lived for decades in Argentina, in Brazil, in Paraguay, disguised, protected, perhaps even raising a family. The most extreme conspiracies reached for fantasy. Hitler in Antarctica, sheltered in secret Nazi bases beneath the ice. Hitler in the Middle East, negotiating with Arab leaders. Hitler cloned in hidden laboratories, preparing a Fourth Reich. The further time passed, the wilder the theories grew. But even the more serious conspiracies thrived, because they contained fragments of plausibility. Submarines had landed in South America. War criminals had escaped. The Ratlines were real. If Eichmann and Mengele had survived, why not Hitler? Books were written, documentaries aired, each adding new twists to the tale. Witnesses swore their accounts. Photographs surfaced, blurry but convincing enough for the willing. Every decade brought a new wave of claims, each more elaborate than the last. And with every claim, the line between fact and fiction blurred further. For many, the conspiracies were entertainment, dark folklore for a new age. But for others, especially survivors of the war, they were torment. The thought that Hitler might have lived free, unpunished, was unbearable. It felt like history mocking its victims. Governments and intelligence agencies did little to kill the myths. In fact, their secrecy often kept them alive. Files remained classified, archives sealed, evidence hidden. Each silence became fuel for conspiracy, each redacted page another spark for suspicion. And so the story refused to die. Decade after decade, the ghost of Hitler resurfaced, in tabloids, in books, in whispered conversations. The dictator's death became not an ending, but a question mark. The irony is cruel. By trying to erase Hitler with fire, his followers only ensured he would live forever in rumor. By hiding evidence, the Soviets made him immortal in myth. By chasing phantoms, the CIA and FBI made him larger in legend than he ever was in life. And in that legend, Hitler achieved what he could not in flesh. He became eternal, not as a man, but as a ghost that haunted the modern world. But myths, no matter how powerful, eventually collide with truth. And the truth lies not in headlines or conspiracies, but in the ashes, the bones, and the evidence, however flawed, however hidden. The final verdict on Hitler's fate would not come from rumor. It would come from science, from forensics, from the very remains that had been locked away for decades. And those remains would finally force the world to face the question: what really was covered up? After decades of rumor, propaganda, and endless speculation, the question of Hitler's death returned to where it had begun, in the ashes of Berlin. The answer would come not from whispers, but from science. The evidence was simple, fragile, and incomplete. A jawbone, a set of teeth, fragments of bone charred by fire. For years they sat in Soviet vaults, guarded like relics, hidden from the world. And then, piece by piece, they were examined. The first breakthrough came not from the skull fragment, the one later revealed to belong to a woman, but from the teeth. Soviet pathologists in 1946 had already compared them against Hitler's dental records and against testimony from his dental staff. Kathy Huserman, the assistant to Hitler's dentist, was shown the remains under interrogation. She confirmed the bridgework, the gold crowns, the fillings, details too precise to deny. "Those are Hitler's teeth," she said. Her confirmation sealed the Soviet claim. But because this testimony came from behind the Iron Curtain, the West doubted it. For decades, no outside scientist could verify the conclusion. The secrecy kept the ghost alive. Only in 2017 did a French team, led by forensic expert Philippe Charlier, gain access to the jawbone and teeth in Moscow. What they found silenced many of the doubts. The bridgework, fillings, and dental patterns matched Hitler's records exactly. The chemistry of the teeth revealed traces of cyanide poisoning, consistent with eyewitness accounts of his final moments. The conclusion was unmistakable. The jaw belonged to Adolf Hitler. The final forensic verdict was clear. Hitler had died in Berlin, just as the original reports claimed. The bullet, the cyanide, the fire in the Chancellery Garden, all of it was true. Yet even in certainty, shadows remained. Why had the Soviets hidden this evidence for so long? Why had they presented a false skull as proof for decades? Why had Stalin himself suggested Hitler had escaped, if he held the real remains in his vaults? The answers lie not in science, but in politics. Stalin thrived on fear, and Hitler's ghost was useful. By keeping the truth uncertain, he controlled the story, manipulated the West, and justified his grip on Eastern Europe. The deception was not about Hitler's survival, it was about power. Forensic science had finally closed the case. Hitler died in his bunker on April 30th, 1945. He did not flee to Argentina. He did not live in the Andes. He did not command a Fourth Reich from the shadows. His empire died with him, buried in the rubble of Berlin. And yet, the verdict did not kill the myth. Because myths are not bound by evidence. They thrive on secrecy, on silence, on the hunger for legends larger than life. The final forensic truth may end the debate among scientists. But in the minds of millions, the ghost of Hitler walks on. Because what science proves, conspiracy can always deny. And that denial, the refusal to let the dictator truly die, may be the most dangerous legacy of all. The truth of Hitler's death was never just about a corpse. It was about control. From the moment the gunshot echoed in the bunker, the story of the Führer's fate became a battlefield of its own. And on that battlefield, secrecy was a weapon. The Soviets covered up the evidence. They seized the remains, locked them in vaults, and revealed only fragments of information, never the whole picture. Why? Because ambiguity was power. Stalin used it to unsettle the Allies, to keep Germany fearful, and to justify the tightening iron grip of Soviet authority across Eastern Europe. A Hitler who was possibly alive kept the world off balance. The West, too, played its part. The Allies could not display Hitler's body. They never had it. Instead, they leaned on the Soviet claim while privately doubting its reliability. Intelligence agencies investigated, filed reports, and tracked rumors, but they rarely admitted to the public how uncertain they truly were. To admit doubt was to risk panic, to risk undermining the victory they had paid for in blood. So silence was chosen. Doubt was buried in classified files. The public was given closure, while behind closed doors the hunt went on. This cover-up was not a grand conspiracy to hide Hitler alive. It was something more cynical, the manipulation of uncertainty for political gain. The Soviets lied, knowing the myth would serve them. The West withheld, knowing the truth was too fragile. And in between, conspiracy theorists, journalists, and profiteers fanned the flames into legend. The irony is brutal. Hitler, who sought immortality through empire, achieved it instead through mystery. The cover-ups ensured that he would never fully die in the world's imagination. Every silence, every withheld file, every contradictory report gave him new life. Not as a man, but as a ghost. And that ghost served many masters. For Stalin, it justified vigilance. For Western agencies, it excused surveillance. For writers and filmmakers, it sold stories. For conspiracy theorists, it offered endless fuel. What was covered up was not simply Hitler's death, but the fragility of truth itself in a world of power politics. The forensic verdict tells us the dictator died in 1945. The cover-ups explain why the world doubted it for decades. And in that gap between truth and myth, Hitler became something far more dangerous than a corpse. He became eternal rumor. A shadow that could be conjured whenever fear was needed, a name whispered whenever evil required a face. The man died in a bunker. But the legend, kept alive by lies, silences, and cover-ups, never died at all. And so the question remains, was it incompetence or was it design? Was it chaos or was it strategy? Did the world stumble into confusion, or was confusion the plan all along? Perhaps we will never know. But one thing is certain. The cover-up ensured Hitler's death would never feel final. It made his ghost as powerful as his armies once were. And in that ghost, the shadow of the Reich lived on. The story began with fire. A pistol in a bunker. A cyanide capsule. Flames in a ruined garden. The end of Adolf Hitler. At least, the end as history recorded it. But history is not always clean. It is not always final. And Hitler's death, instead of closing the book, tore its pages apart. The Allies announced his suicide. The Soviets seized the evidence. But there was no body shown to the public, no irrefutable proof paraded before the world. Only fragments, locked away in silence. And into that silence poured rumor, propaganda, and conspiracy. For decades, the world chased his ghost. Intelligence files filled with sightings. Newspapers sold headlines. Witnesses swore they had seen him in Argentina, in Spain, in the jungles of Brazil. The Soviets taunted the West, claiming Hitler had fled. The CIA and FBI kept their own files open, unwilling to dismiss the possibility. It was a story too intoxicating to die. Because the truth was messy, and because the myth was useful. The Soviets covered up, because ambiguity gave them power. The West withheld, because uncertainty protected their victory. And all the while the public imagined. Imagine submarines, safe houses, secret colonies. Imagine the dictator walking free under false names, biding his time, waiting to strike again. What the fire in Berlin could not achieve, secrecy accomplished. Hitler became immortal, not as a man but as a legend. Science, at last, cut through the shadows. Forensic analysis of his teeth and jaw confirmed what eyewitnesses had said in 1945. Hitler had died in the bunker, just as the war was collapsing around him. His body had been burned, his remains hidden. There was no escape to Argentina, no submarine to Patagonia, no Fourth Reich in exile. The Führer ended not in triumph, but in a shallow grave of rubble and ash. Yet the myth remains, because myths do not obey evidence. They live in fear, in silence, in the hunger for stories too large to end. In the end, Hitler achieved something twisted. He promised a Reich that would last 1,000 years. It crumbled in 12. But through lies, propaganda, and doubt, his death became endless. His ghost became eternal. And that is the most chilling truth of all. The dictator who built an empire on deception died in deception. His body consumed by flames, his memory consumed by rumor. The cover-ups ensured that his death would never bring peace, only questions. So the mystery lingers. Not because Hitler survived, but because power chose to keep his shadow alive. The death of Adolf Hitler was not the end of a man. It was the birth of a myth that still walks with us. In headlines, in whispers, in every conspiracy that refuses to let go. Perhaps that is the final lesson. That even in death, evil can endure, not in flesh, but in the stories we tell, in the doubts we allow, in the myths we refuse to bury. The world waited for closure. What it received was a ghost. And that ghost, born in fire and silence in April 1945, has never truly died.